So thank you very much again for having accepted the invitation and generosity and the time and effort you made. So I have some, as usual, I have some introductory notes about you and then my questions. Susan Wolf is an American moral philosopher and philosopher of action who is currently teaching at the University of North Carolina. She taught previously at Johns Hopkins University, the University of Maryland, and Harvard University. Wolf's work centers on the relation between freedom, morality, happiness, and meaningfulness in life. Among her works are Freedom Within Reason, Understanding Love, Philosophy, Film and Fiction, which was edited, I suppose, The Variety of Values, Essays on Morality, Meaning and Value, and so finally, Meaning in Life and Why It Matters, Princeton University Press, 2012. The essays in the book, as Stefan Macedo writes in the introduction, are philosophically, I quote him, are philosophically rigorous, but also accessible, topical, and colorfully written. And they are terrific places to begin thinking seriously about meaning in life and why it matters. I absolutely agree with him. So, so the first question, actually like two questions perhaps embedded in one question. Why is it that some people think of the meaning of life and some don't? Can we say that most people who have meaning in their lives are not even aware of it and don't even need to be aware of it?
I don't know about most people, but I do think having meaning in life doesn't depend on thinking about it. And often I think if you have meaning in life, you're less likely to think about it than if you don't have meaning in life, then at least some people will feel an absence there and a yearning of some ineffable kind. And so it will be the absence of meaning that makes them think about it rather than needing to think about it in order to get it.
But I mean, why is it that some people think of meaning in life and some don't? I mean, can we generally say that those who think of meaning in life, they are those who are feeling the lack of it, like generally?
Well, okay. I guess there are two kinds of explanations for why people don't think of meaning in life. Not everyone, I think, is sensitive to the value of meaning in life. I think there are people, and maybe it's a meaningfulness as a value is itself a culturally constructed value. So people of some cultures, it's not in any way, available to them. Then even within a society, American, Western society, I think for many centuries, it has had it as a value. But there are some people who don't get it, who don't, even if you talk about it and try to say like, happiness isn't the same as meaning, don't you want more than just pleasure in your life? We'll just say, no, all I want is pleasure, and they don't feel any absence. So they might not think about it because it's not a value for them.
Right.
I think, but then there are a lot of people who I think it is a value for them, but you don't necessarily have to think about that value in order for it to have a role in the quality of your life. And so it's in that second category that I would say people whose lives are fully, from my sort of third person perspective, are fully and deeply meaningful, might never have a thought with that concept in it because they're just into their lives, getting satisfaction from the things that I think give it meaning without having to articulate that at any level of consciousness, I think.
So as if there is a flow of meaningful life that you don't actually get out of it to think about it.
Right. Good. Yes.
Mm. Yet there is a very interesting distinction, I think your book proposes, a distinction that, I mean, the standard distinction to draw between meaning in life, where a human person is what can exhibit meaning, and the meaning of life in a narrow sense, where the
Yes.
human...
Excuse me. Let me
Yeah.
get rid of this. Okay. I don't know if that'll work.
All right. So I repeat the second question. That there is, I mean, yet there is a very interesting distinction in my idea, standard distinction to draw between the meaning in life, where a human person is what can exhibit meaning, and the meaning of life in a narrow sense, where the human species as a whole is what can be meaningful or not. You think we are witnessing a shift from the classical question of meaning of life to the question of meaning in life? I mean, for instance, when a religious person, a believer, believes in the life after death, he or she is probably satisfied with the meaning of life. But for a non-believer, what remains is seeking for meaningfulness in his or her life, or creating it.
So to put it in my own terms, I guess I think, right. So as I understand it, I don't know if this was a standard distinction when I started writing about this, but as I understand it, the standard philosophical question, of, the previous, since the big, the existentialists at least, is, there a meaning to life? What is the meaning of life? It's a meaning of life question, where it is a question, as you point out, of about the species, about human existence. Like, why are we here? Do we have a purpose? It's that kind of question. And if you have a certain kind of religious metaphysics, you have a positive answer to that, whatever that answer is. A different question is, does my life have any meaning? Is it meaningful? Where the question doesn't have to be, is the species here for a reason? Or even, it doesn't have to be, am I here for a reason? That is, was I put here for a reason? It's rather, is it a life that has significance? I think usually, there's a kind of context in which the thought is, does it have a significance to anyone outside myself? Or does it, is there, is there something worthwhile about what I'm doing? I mean, these things are all related. So when we talk about a life being meaningful, as opposed to human life having a meaning, we're talking about something more individual about the individual, but also it has to do with the way the individual lives their life, rather than, it's not like when you ask, is there a meaning to life, or is there a meaning of life? It's a question that's either yes or no, independent of the details of what people do with it. Whereas, is my life meaningful, does depend on the details. I mean, my life may be meaningful or not. I could make it more meaningful, or it can be more or less. So it's a different kind of question. But then to come back to your two questions, one about religion and the other about whether we're facing a transition. I think in the case, I think these are two coherent questions that aren't identical, but that if you're religious, a certain kind of religious anyway, the answer to the one question is closely related to the answer to the second. So it's not that, all I care about is whether there's a meaning of life. It's that the meaning of life gives some guidance into what the meaning of your own life or would be, or how it would be most meaningful. So, if you think God put me here for a reason, or God put us here for a reason, then the way my life can be most positively meaningful would be by, living as God wants me to live, or something like that, right? So they do care about meaning in life, but it's related and dependent on there being a meaning of life, right?
Right.
Right. To just say, let's just focus on meaning in life allows one to focus on that independent of religious metaphysics if one doesn't have one. So one answer, so it seems to me, if you have a secular point of view, the question, is my life meaningful, is just as important and maybe harder to answer than if you've got a religious context. So to the question, are we moving from one to the other? I think insofar as, societies are becoming more secular, yes, we're moving from one to the other, because the first seems to have no, or if you're, I think science provides the context of
Right.
what, how human species got here, right? Then the first question doesn't have much optimistic to say, but you could. The second question isn't undermined by that.
I see. Right. The book addresses a false dichotomy. As you call it, a false dichotomy from the scratch, from the beginning. The aim of the book, especially in the first lecture, is to clarify a point. Meaningfulness is neither happiness nor self-interest, which is the kernel of the book. Can you please elaborate it?
Neither happiness nor morality. Right.
Right. Neither happiness nor morality. Sorry. Yeah.
Right. Well, my idea is, or was, that in philosophy, but also I think in popular culture, people tend to think there are two kinds of values one can aim for in one's life. Self-interest, which is identified with happiness and a life of more pleasure than pain, basically, and morality, which is trying to do what from a more objective or impersonal standpoint is considered right or good or valuable. Some philosophies will say really it's all self-interest, and happiness is the only real value. Your own happiness is the only real value. Others will say, no, that's just, each of us is one person among others, so the only real value is morality. And others will say, well, look, everybody, has reason to care about their own happiness, especially, but you shouldn't just care about your own happiness. You should also try to be moral. So it presents a picture as if what you should care about when making decisions about what to do and how to live is you should care about your own happiness, and or you should care about doing the right thing or the good of the world, some version of morality. And it was my thought that actually that doesn't give a very accurate picture of what most of us do in our lives. And more importantly, or as importantly, it doesn't give a picture of what matters the most about our lives to us. So the kinds of examples I had are some of them are, we do things for the sake of some individual we love. I stay up all night, try to do what my daughter needs for school the next day, or worrying about nursing her through an illness, and I'm not really doing it because it will make me happier. And nor am I doing it because it's the best thing in the world to do, or the morally necessary thing to do. I'm doing it for her sake. It's her welfare that I'm orienting myself to, and I'm not putting that inside of a context of self-interest or morality. It's like, right? And then the other kind of example I use are passions that aren't for individual people. So maybe for some, for art or for philosophy, or, or for gardening, I spend hours gardening, or because I want my garden to be beautiful. And it may be more, it's not that it gives me as much happiness as the time wouldn't be rationally spent if it were just my happiness I was looking for, because I could be happier if I had a less nice garden and, went out for a walk or something. Nor could it obviously be justified by being morally important, because it's just not really important. So the thought is, why am I giving so much of my energy and attention to my daughter? Why am I giving so much of my energy and attention to, to the garden? The first answer is because I love them, or I love something that, that they're reflecting. So my daughter, it's just love of my daughter means that I will do things out of love for her, even if it's a sacrifice to myself, even if it's a sacrifice, I would say, or at least a less than optimal morally good thing. But I think the same is true. I'm not actually a gardener, but the same is true, I think, of people who are gardeners. They are devoted to it as something kind of beyond themselves, but clearly not morally. So my claim is that the meaning in our lives really comes mostly from those things, from doing things that we love in a certain way, but I also say, maybe it's packed into it, the nature of the love, that we're loving it because we recognize it as having a value beyond ourselves. So, so the idea is meaningfulness is a matter of engaging in something you love that has value beyond yourself. And that's not identical, obviously, to self-interest, because the value isn't the value, or the amount of value isn't dependent on how good it is for you. It's good in itself or for something else. But neither is it necessarily of the greatest moral value, because, well, either example would do. A garden isn't as valuable as, a cure for cancer.
Right.
You're not going out fighting injustice, but nonetheless, it gives meaning because it's creating a thing of beauty, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Thank you very much. What's clear is that you offer a general understanding of meaningfulness in life, a question which differs dramatically, I would say, from the ones raised in the tradition of continental philosophy, especially the ones which associate meaningfulness with specific situations, such as, for example, limit situations in Jaspers. However, can it be, my question is, can it be that instead of an entirety of meaningfulness, we say that some periods of life are more meaningful than the others, even in the life of one specific person?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. But do you have in mind something? Is this connected to Jaspers, or you have in mind that?
Well, I just pointed out to Jaspers because, like, these Grenzsituationen, these limit situations, like, in case of, I don't know, like famine, war, loving someone, losing someone, death, all these experiences, they are not they are not the examples that you use in the book. But I
No.
think because you're looking for a general understanding or perhaps a formal understanding of meaningfulness. But like sometimes I think that a person who has gone through experience of war in a war-stricken country, might, in comparison to her life abroad, somewhere in the West, for example, think that, okay, that part of my life was more meaningful because I was in an, like, how do you say, like in a critical situation, I was trying to help people out. I was trying to do something and to sacrifice, as you said, like my life. That's, I mean, and based on that, I thought that can we actually sort of, can we sort of imagine a life that had more meaningful periods?
Right. Yes. Well, yes, that seems right to me. I mean, there are all kinds of ways, I think, in which if you look at a life over over the course of an entire life or large sections of it, meaning will go up and down, and for a lot of different reasons. But the one you're mentioning, that is, there's certain contexts in which the choices you make are extremely heavy or potent. I mean, and where you have the opportunity to do something, really remarkable, or to really waste an opportunity. I mean, there might be just, you have more, your choices are somehow more intense in their options, and that, right. So depending on how you make those choices, or which might be totally, it might not even feel like a choice. I think I'm including in some of these cases in war, where you just think, I didn't even think about it, I just rushed in, or how could you turn these people away or something. But so it's not even choices, but the fact is, yes, your life could be most intensely meaningful during a period of crisis, because because it's your chance to do something with more value, and it doesn't have to be moral value, but those are often the cases. So that's one thing. A second thing, not totally unrelated to that, I think, is that when you're faced with such circumstances, when you've lived through them, even, I mean, let's say you're faced with them and they're passing, I think they tend to make us more conscious of what really matters. I mean, this sort of idea of, it sort of sets your priorities straight. You just sort of, you don't find yourself frittering your time or getting all anxious about, you're not sweating the small stuff, as the expression is in the US. And so it might actually lead you to live your life more meaningfully going forward, because you're sort of more aware of how precious certain things are, and how, so, I mean, my parents were refugees from Hitler, so they, and I think I think it governed, it shaped their way of living after. I mean, of course, it can shape, such things can shape your way of living in many different ways. But with my parents, I think it was just the preciousness of loved ones was was so huge because of who they lost, and how, who else they might have lost. And so things like that, I think, mattered, so that's another way in which you could live your life more meaningfully because of those circumstances. But then there's also just, sometimes in a perfectly non-limit situation, there are just periods when you're down, you're just sort of, going on rote, and it's, nothing. I mean, I actually think for a lot of people, COVID has done that so many of us have just found our ability to really engage with things flattened, that, there have just been slow periods in one's life. But I guess I just think we shouldn't be
Yeah.
too hard on ourselves.
I mean, it's a very interesting example because I mean, like, I come from with this background here from a society. Like, I mean, I was born 1980. Like, I was 3 months the war started, like the Gulf War started. So sort of when I look back, like retrospectively, my life in Iran, I lived like 20 years and 28 years in Iran. So my life was sort of loaded with meaning and meaningfulness. So to a person who lives in Iran, I mean, being able or training herself to somehow sort out new ways of creating meaning in life is an art, I would say. But then you come here and you see that the society is an sort of a moral society, yeah, but you don't have that much of this socio-political engagement to that society. That's why you don't have that much of the chance to bring meaning to your life, except living morally or living based on your self-interest and happiness, you know. So that's why it's sort of a conflicted situation. I mean, my example is always a refugee, you know, like for a person who comes from that background to this lifestyle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I mean, my my life of comfort and sort of never having really been in a limit situation myself shows in the way I'm in what I've been, the way I've thought through these conceptual issues, because I mean, we all write about our own lives in some way, and then try to generalize. But I think thinking about living in life where, look, you're packed with meaning, you have to be. I mean, because you either have to be or you're kind of living dead inside, right? I mean, if you're going to live in a world with so much challenge, so much to fear, so much to, just political issues all around you, right? You can't really avoid meaning if you're going to live attentively. Right. So to your earlier question, are there some people who don't think about it but still live meaningful? That might be the perfect example. Sure. I mean, why would you have to think about it? Right? I'm figuring out how to, what the best way to live in that context is the challenge, but that it'll be meaningful is not actually in doubt, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
There are plenty of beautiful examples in the book. Like, to ask whether someone's life is meaningful is not one and the same as asking whether her life is pleasant or she is subjectively well off. A life in an experience machine or virtual reality device would surely be a happy one, but very few take it to be a candidate for meaningfulness. You bring up some brilliant examples, as I say in the book, which, although are bizarre cases, but are amusingly enlightening. A man who lives to make handwritten copies of the text of War and Peace, or a woman whose world revolves around her love for a pet goldfish. Do you mean by these examples that a pleasant life does not guarantee a meaningful life? I mean, although you answered my question, but I just like you please to elaborate it. Like this is a very bizarre but interesting example, like devoting yourself to your dog or to your goldfish.
Right. Well, so actually, I mean, the point of those examples was not to distinguish meaning from pleasantness, so much as to distinguish what, as I would describe it, really having meaning from feeling like or thinking you have meaning. So they're two different things that I'm trying to distinguish meaning from. Pleasantness, I mean, you can imagine, I mean, as you say, someone in just who's plugged into a virtual reality world that's programmed to just enjoy everything, or I mean, you could just say, look, you can have, you know, all the ice cream, spend your life watching, the best movies, and, just getting pleasure from all kinds of things. I mean, that doesn't even have to be virtual reality. You could, I mean, someone in a very strange, I mean, it could be you're really watching the best movies and having all the ice cream you want and whatever, but and it's just all fun. But I think that's not necessarily meaningful. And those of us who have the opportunity for a lot of pleasure still want something other than mere pleasure in our lives. So that's the one thing. The second is, so we want something that we think is somehow worthwhile in not just because it feels good, something that is valuable. And then the problem is what's valuable, to which a lot of people will say, well, there's no objective answer to that. It's just, if it's valuable to you, that's the answer to the question, what's valuable, relevant to meaning. So these examples of, someone might think what's valuable is, just giving my goldfish the best goldfish life possible, or, honoring Tolstoy by copying War and Peace over and over again. And there, the problem, it's not necessarily that the person feels good about it, it feels pleasure. It's that they think what they're doing is worthwhile, but at least in terms of proportionality, it's not worthwhile. I mean, it's in the case of copying the novel out, has no value beyond the person's own subjective gratification. I mean, we have printing presses and the internet and Kindle, and we don't need a copy of War and Peace anymore. I mean, that example has raised questions in audiences of, what about the monks who were copying out the Bible, right? That was a very different context, and the value of what they were doing is much different from the value of my eccentric friend. So,
right.
Yeah.
You advance what you call the fitting fulfillment view of the meaning of life. Meaning arises, I'm quoting you, when subjective attraction meets objective attractiveness, and one is able to do something about it or with it, end of quote. What's the fulfillment view? I mean, and why is not sufficient?
Right. So this is directly connected to what I said a minute ago. Yeah. And so the fitting fulfillment view is the view after which my so-called fitting fulfillment view is a revision. The fitting fulfillment view, which I think is a very common view in kind of in an unreflective, at least American attitude, is just the view that your life is meaningful as long as it's filled with things that fulfill you, where fulfillment is it's a feeling or a character of your experience that is almost identical to to say this fulfills me is almost identical to it feels meaningful. I mean, it's when we talk about a job being fulfilling, or not fulfilling, it's that you feel something. There's something about it that makes you feel. I guess I'm inclined to say it makes you feel like it's worthwhile, but right, and but it's also it's that you love doing it, but in a certain way. It's not, I mean, I think when you might love, you know, riding on a roller coaster, but you wouldn't say that that's fulfilling. It doesn't have the right character. So it's a kind of richness to your experience that comes with a particular activity. And what I take to be wrong with the mere fulfillment view, I mean, I think there's a lot to it. I mean, it makes sense that someone would come up with this view, would think, yeah, a life is meaningful. You know what, I mean, think of what it would be or what it is for someone to feel like, oh, my life lacks meaning. I need, you know, I want more meaning in life. Again, I don't know how cross-cultural this is, but in America, it's pretty common, and there are lots of self-help books written about how to make your life more meaningful. And it's usually aroused by a kind of feeling of emptiness, which isn't the same as unhappiness or pain. It's compatible with having, being comfortable financially, being comfortable, sensually, but still you think like there's something missing. What is it? So what you want is this something that will give you this other feeling, which is called fulfillment. The problem is that if all you want is anything that gives you that feeling, then it's possible for you to be attached to something that I think the feeling connects to a belief that it's worthwhile, that what you're doing is worthwhile or valuable, but not everything is worthwhile or valuable, or certainly not everything is worthwhile or valuable enough to justify devoting your life to it, or devoting, large parts of your life to it and ignoring other things. So the problem is it allows the illusion of that your life is involved with something important or worthwhile when it isn't. And so these examples that you mentioned are are the kind of weird examples of, there aren't actually a lot of people out there who want to just copy War and Peace all the time, or are devoted to their goldfish. But there are people who are in cults, for example, religious cults. There are people who are, well, it'll be controversial which people these are, but who are deluded about the value of what they're doing. They think what they're doing is really important and therefore meaningful, but it's not. And so, so that was, so the fulfillment view won't make that judgment. They won't distinguish between something really being meaningful and it's seeming to be meaningful, because fulfillment is just about it seeming to be meaningful.
Don't you think that somehow this fulfillment view, which happened to be very interesting, not only America, I think globally, is becoming more and more interesting, interesting to people actually, is the reason for that, isn't it that it sort of precludes pain and anxiety? I mean, that's why, like the fulfillment view, as you said, makes you feel worthwhile or meaningful. So I want to make a distinction. I want to somehow conceptually find out what lacks there, or what is there, what's missing there. And I think that the fitting fulfillment view and fulfillment view, the difference there is that in the fulfillment view, pain and anxiety have been reduced. And
so I guess I think there are two issues that you're identifying that I see as two different issues. One is the positive quality of experience. And even though I talked about it in terms of, happiness is one thing, meaning is another, well, let's just, all right. So there's the difference between how positive or happy but I would include in happy stress-free. I mean, stress is a form of pain, and anxiety is a form of pain. So the more you get rid of that, the more pleasure there is. And then there's the question of objectivity as to, is what I'm doing really valuable, or or am I just feeling like it's valuable, or not noticing whether it's valuable, right? And I want to say, look, to have a truly meaningful life, it has to be valuable. And it won't necessarily be, pleasurable, or, I mean, there'll be something good about the feeling you have when you're involved in it, but it certainly won't be stress-free. Usually it isn't. But it seems to me the fulfillment view doesn't suggest that, as I was defining the fulfillment view, it also doesn't have to be stress-free. I mean, the fulfillment view is you have to find something that you have a passion for, right? That you love doing, and really care about, and do it. And it doesn't matter what it is, as long as you have a passion and you can do it. But of course, depending on what your passion, I mean, that doesn't guarantee that it's something worthwhile. I mean, think of the woman with the goldfish, right? When the goldfish dies, her life isn't guaranteed to be pain-free. The goldfish died anyway, and this is what her whole life was built on, right? So, again, a cult is a good example of people, people who are in some kind of cult where the cult leader, instructs them about how they have to behave, and they think their life is totally meaningful because they're devoted to this false god or something. But it could be, it's a very strenuous and challenging and difficult life that it's just that they're following. So I don't think, I mean, it's true that we want pain-free, that's something I think people care way too much about. I don't think that's the difference between the fulfillment view and the fitting fulfillment view.
All right. But still, can't we claim that somehow pain and anxiety, I mean, I suppose there is no general recipe for it. It's clear in the book you're not writing recipe for meaningfulness, but can we not even claim that like meaningful life has some elements of pain and anxiety in itself?
I would make
more than other views.
So that seems to me, in some ways, an empirical claim. One that is, I think, look, one of the themes that is, I think, in line with what you're suggesting of saying thing, look, meaning is not the same as happiness. But once we recognize meaning as distinct, and for those of us, which I think is maybe most of us, who once you recognize it, say, yeah, that is really important, that's as important as happiness, will see that because meaning, that is no guarantee of pleasure, and most projects for most people that give them meaning are ones that are going to involve significant pain, stress, difficult. Means like, stop worrying about pain. Like, just pain is part of life, and just, take it and move on. I mean, it's not the idea of wanting to avoid pain or even minimize pain. That is, I think, a kind of short-sighted thing to care about so much. I mean, obviously there are cases and cases, and pain sucks. Like, nobody wants it, and you should avoid it. But it's, on the other hand, if you have it, you have it. So it is a part of my view that avoidance of pain is overrated. That seeking pleasure is overrated too, in a way. But on the other hand, it's not like an essential feature of what gives us meaning. I mean, look, the things, so here are two kinds of examples. One, the relationships with, intimate relationships give a lot of meaning to a lot of lives. And sometimes they're just, they're great. They're tremendously pleasurable. I mean, you can just have a wonderful relationship that, I mean, there's vulnerability because that things can go wrong, but it doesn't have to be painful. Usually there's pain, but in over time. Similarly, I think certain kinds of, I mean, I don't think like artistic achievement, there's a stereotype of the tortured artist, and a lot of artists are tortured and they make great art, but it's not essential. And if you look at certain kinds of art, or you hear Ella Fitzgerald sing and you think, I don't hear any torture there. It's just like, part of what's great about Ella Fitzgerald is the pleasure of, there's just a pure pleasure that's coming out of her vocal cords. And so, yeah, lucky her.
Very interesting. Yet, I mean, you mentioned somewhere like some minutes ago, this sort of socially or culturally constructed part of meaning and meaningfulness. I have one question here that I sometimes think that, I mean, I just try to formulate it these ways, that there seems to be sometimes in where I am living a tendency in moralizing what can be meaningful in itself. In a sense, when people think that I am gardening and I'm teaching only because it benefits others, or it's like based on self-interest, the society gives me the feeling that I'm making out of what could be meaningful something moral. I hope my question is clear, but my example is a refugee who comes from, let's say, Afghanistan to Germany. In her view, visiting her sick grandma and spending, or as you said, sacrificing the time with her overnight is simply a meaningful act, perhaps out of like simple generosity or just meaningful. But she might be conflicted in a society where these meaningful acts can be seen, regarded, or seen as moral acts, that you're just respecting your parents, So can we go that far to say that, I mean, there are some cross-cultural tensions sometimes, that something that was for me meaningful might be moral here. And I mean, I worked with refugees. I've been working like 6 years with refugees in Berlin. And sometimes I have the impression, I mean, as raw as it is, my impression is that sometimes the reason that some of them are depressed here is that they don't have that much of access to something that was meaningful back home. And they are like, they are faced with the choice between living morally and living based on self-interest.
Right.
I don't know, I hope it was sensible to you, this example and this whole question.
Well, I'm not sure I get it completely. So I do think, well, there are two things. First of all, it's something can be both morally valuable and meaningful. I mean, right, that they're not, in saying meaning is different from morality and different from happiness or or pleasure. I don't mean to say it can only be one of these three things. It could be all three at once, actually. It was rather, if you're motivated just by, I want as much pleasure as possible, then some things that we would choose will be different if what we're looking for is meaning in our lives. And the same thing with morality, but often the things that give meaning to our lives are also morally good, or are also, pleasurable. So they're not, so that's not necessarily a contrast. At the same time, I think, to go back to that dichotomy that I, started out by saying, look, this is a false dichotomy. I think because a lot of kind of public discourse thinks either you're doing it in order to make yourself happy, or you're doing it out of a kind of moral virtue. They feel like they have to put everything into one of these categories or the other. And so they, in order to justify what they're doing, they turn it into something. They think, oh, this is more, I'm doing this because it's morally good. And if it weren't, I wouldn't be doing it. And I think that's a distortion of why, what's really motivating us, and a distortion it's a mistake to try to justify everything in terms of either morality or self-interest. I mean, so I do think it's common for people to interpret things as morally good when I think, oh, forget that. That's really irrelevant. But when you talk about refugees who are living in a culture, quite alien, I'm not sure how what I just said connects to that at all. It does seem to me quite easy. I mean, it seems right that that kind of situation might leave you, at least for the, for some long period of time, unable to find sources or avenues for meaning, because the things that would give you meaning are just not available in that culture, including the human appreciation of the same things you have. And so, right, you can do things, you can have ice cream and right, make yourself feel better. You can do morally right things, but there'll be a certain emptiness, I think, inside that would be right. That would be very depressing. I mean, it would make sense of depression, I think.
Thank you very much. That was really, fantastic, both reading the books and talking to you. The book is very, as I told you, it was really easy to read, but very rich and enlightening. I mean, once I started reading it, I just like after 3 hours, I thought, okay, it's done. I mean, I got the point. So it was very clear and it was very helpful. And then, yeah, and also now talking to you, I had some questions. I hope they were somehow relevant to the book.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. No, and there's more to think about. I mean, right, you've given me more to think about. So
yeah, I mean, like one point I was thinking about, like in the middle of our discussion, was like, how can one apply meaning in life into meaning in work? Like in the case of
meaning in work.
Yeah. Like, I mean, people talk about dream jobs, and sometimes they don't know if they're talking about the job that makes them happy, the job that is moral, or the job that is meaningful.
Right.
So that's another constellation that you would like to think about it, which would be
right. Well, it's not, as autobiographical background. I mean, one could be working on in any way to ask oneself about the meaningfulness of one's work. But if you're an analytic philosopher, it seems to me quite appropriate to be saying, is there any, what am I doing with my life? I mean, there are times when I have to say fairly often, I'll go to a paper being, presented, a colloquium in my department, and I'll just imagine, what if my family saw this? What would they think? And I know what they would think. What are you wasting your time? And so I do think, for me, the question, from the beginning of my trying to pursue this philosophically included, is it or is it not a meaningful way to spend one's life, but as a career professionally. Sometimes I wish more philosophers ask that question. I mean, obviously, I think the answer is yes. Well, not obviously, but I do think philosophy is a meaningful thing to do. But it's not obvious, and not all philosophy necessarily, is on an even footing there. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much indeed for the time, Suzanne.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Yeah, thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks. You too. Yeah. Well, good evening. Whatever.
Yeah. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.